Daf Chesam Beis 8b, and we're at Toner Rabbanon Evet Shehid Gittin Katzavay. Toner Rabbanon, about halfway down the page on Chesam Beis.
More maritime law.
Discussing yesterday the idea that an Evet, it's an indentured servant or a slave, in order for him to get free, he has a document called a get shechur. Now, yesterday I told you that the most common way for a slave to be freed is with this document called get shechur. There are other ways as well. If the master makes him lose a limb, he leaves. He's freed. There's debate whether we write an additional get shechur, a divorce freedom document or not. But regardless, he's a free man. And the other way is if a guy gives a gift to the slave of himself. So if a person says, I'm giving all my assets to my slave. So he gave not only his assets, but he also gave his slave to his slave, which means effectively he becomes a free man. Okay, so that's sort of the discussion. He says in the document that you and my assets are all belong to you. So the halacha is he acquires himself, but he does not acquire the assets. Why not? Because with regard to the assets, it requires witnesses. In other words, just like a divorce requires b'fanei, so too the document to make somebody free, a freedom document also does. However, the difference is that with regard to the Evet himself, he's believed to be mekayim the document, to verify it by saying b'fanei. However, with regard to the assets, that requires a proper kiyum shtaris, which needs two witnesses. So the Gemara asks, a question. The guy gives everything to his slave. So the first case was he said, you and my assets now belong to you. What happens if he says everything belongs to you? Abai says, because he's believed about himself, he's believed also with regard to the assets. In other words, he gets everything. Rava says, hold on. It makes sense that he should acquire himself, just like a woman is believed to say that her divorce is valid by saying b'fanei, so too the slave is believed to say that his freedom is valid. However, with regard to the assets, he should not acquire them. Because to verify a regular document, that requires two witnesses. So therefore, b'fanei does not work. And therefore, he should not be believed on the other assets. Now remember, over here, he wasn't two different statements. It was one statement. He said, everything I own belongs to you. It's a single statement. And yet we find that he should not be believed on the other items. He should only be believed on according to Abai, he's believed in everything. According to Rava, he's not believed in the document.
We're talking about an Ivri slave.
No, we're talking about Kanani slave. An Ivri slave does not need to acquire himself. He's not considered real. He's considered partially owned, but he still has, he's still able to acquire himself. He's still able to acquire for himself. He still owns things. He's not penniless necessarily.
We're talking about Evan Kanani here?
Yes.
Okay.
So Hadar Amar Abai said, hold on. If he's not believed with regard to the assets, since he doesn't acquire the assets, he doesn't acquire himself also. Rava says, no. Why is that? It makes sense he shouldn't acquire the assets because it's comparable to the regular verification of documents. But to acquire himself, he should be able to do that. Just like a woman is believed to bring her own divorce and say it was written correctly, so too with a slave. Rava says, whether he said you and my assets, or whether he said all my assets belong to you. In both cases, the Eved acquires himself, but not the assets. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is he said, I'm giving you everything. It's a single statement. And now we're interpreting that as two statements. Number one, you. Number two, my assets. This idea of taking what somebody said and splitting it into two and saying you believed in half, you're not believing the other half, is a major question in the Gemara. The classical instance that you learned in Yivamis was if a guy says, I voluntarily participated in a homosexual act. Right. So now the question is, can we execute the man who committed the act? Because we say the guy is believed with regard to saying the other guy is guilty of a capital crime, but not believed with regard to himself as being the participating member of the crime, or do we say that no, because he's not believed on himself, he's not believed on the other guy? And that's sort of the classical instance. And that is sort of different. Why is it different? Because the general rule is that a person is not believed to say testimony about himself that's negative. Now, this is true with regard to monetary matters. You say that you're guilty in a lawsuit, then you are guilty. You'll pay a civil suit. You'll pay out whatever is asked for. Obviously, because civil in monetary matters, you do have control over it. However, with regard, you can't convict yourself of lashes or capital punishment. It's a concept called Ein Adam Meisem Atzmo Rash. You can't declare yourself a wicked person. So in this case, we say that we believe him to say the other guy was committed a criminal act of capital punishment, but we don't believe him to say that he was the participant in that act. It really is two different statements.
Could you repeat those two statements one more time, Rabbi?
We believe him to say the other man committed an act of capital that requires capital punishment,
okay,
but we don't believe him to say that he was a voluntary participant in that act.
Right. Is this just in capital cases, or
No, it would be a case if he I don't know, if he says he fed the guy
because in our
if he says
society, you can confess. A lot of instances, confess to a crime and avoid a jury trial, or just go to summary judgment, what have you. It's just interesting to.
Yeah, a person is not able to convict himself in any criminal type of indictment under Jewish law. There's no such thing. You're not believed to sign an affidavit, convicting yourself. Yeah, there's no need for Miranda rights, as I would say. Right, every person is not. You're just not believed. Period. Yeah.
You can't incriminate yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Well, but here it's moreover. You can't.
Yes, right.
Cannot commit yourself. Okay. Now that's a different story because it's really two components of the story. Number one, who committed the act. Number two, who the participant is. Over here, it's one. There's a single statement here. The statement is everything that I own belongs to you. And now we're splitting the statement into two. We're saying on the one hand, the slave owns himself. On the other hand, he actually don't believe him with regard to anything else. It's a bit of a different. So the Gemara gives a different example of גיטין Dibura. Tonight we look. Combine Reb Shimon. Amar Rav Ramas and Rav. So Rav says to Rav, "Combine who is this like? Reb Shimon. It must be like Reb Shimon. Amar גיטין Dibura. And we split what he said. The time we learn. Someone who promises all of his assets to his slave. Yotza ben Charon. His slave is a free man, obviously. Shayar karga kol shehu lo yotza ben Charon. However, if he leaves over a little bit of assets, then we say he's not a free man. Why not? Because, in other words, he says, I'm giving my slave all my assets except for my house. Sorry, take that back. Yeah, he says, I'm giving my slave all my assets except for my house. The slave does not go free. Why not? Because you say just like he left over his house, he actually left over his slave too, but didn't tell him about it. So in other words, I'm giving you everything except for you. Effectively means that I'm giving you nothing.
It's a hard one.
What?
That's hard to understand.
Yeah, no, he's trying to express to him how valuable he is, but he doesn't want it for him. He's saying he's worth you're worth everything I own, except for this, and except for that, except for yourself. It's just a nice statement of how valuable you are. But he isn't actually, but he actually does not mean to free him.
So
However,
the intention of not including the house is the intention of not taking them free.
Yeah.
That's right.
Reb Shimon Omer, Reb Shimon says, "Lo'olam hu ben chayrin." He's always a free man, because we presume what he said is what he said. We didn't say it's what he say. Ad sheyomer, unless he says, "Kol nechsai nesinu l'ploini avdi chutz me'echad me'riba shemen." I'm giving everything to my slave except for 1/10,000th. And obviously, the message here is that the slave is worth 1/10,000th of his assets. In other words, the slave is worthless. Okay, 1 second. Okay, now let's say the proof is as follows. Let's say the guy says, "I'm giving you all my assets except for one field or one piece of real estate." What actually happens? He doesn't get any pieces of real estate. If he would have said, "I'm not giving you everything except for my house on Southwest 15th Avenue," so then he owns all the real estate except for the house on Southwest 15th Avenue. But if he says instead a piece of real estate, well, which piece of real estate? If the slave points to any given piece, the guy says, "Well, that's the piece I excluded." Right? So effectively, according to Reb Shimon, what happens is, if the guy says, I'm giving you everything except for one piece of real estate, he actually gets no pieces of real estate. And yet he still becomes a free man. Which is an example of him saying something, but we don't actually listen to what he says. He said except for a piece of real estate, but what actually happens is he gets no real estate at all. And the slave still owns himself. That's an example of Pagina Dibura. So what's the problem? Saying Rav is like Rav Shimon. But Amar of Yosef Bar Yumi says, Amar of Nachman, the name of Nachman, Apish Kilos Rav Shimon, even though Rabbi Yossi liked what Rav Shimon said, Halacha Rameir, the halacha remains like Rameir, that we do not say Pagin Dibura. In other words, if he if he leaves out a piece of property, then he leaves out the slave as well. So, and therefore, what's the explanation of Rava? If the guy is not believed on the assets, why is he believed with regard to himself? The Tanya we learned, when the statement of Reb Shimon came before Reb Yossi, Kar all of Mikra Hazeh, he pronounced on Reb Shimon this pasuk: Sifasayim Yishak, the lips will kiss Meished Dvarim Nechoichem, the one who speaks such proper words. Okay. So now the question is a question on Rava. Why is he believed halfway? If it seems that the halacha is that we don't accept that you should be believed halfway. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. Did Rav Nachman actually say the halacha was like Rameir? Mi Amar Nachman Haki. Did Rav Nachman say the halacha is like Rameir? If Amar Yosef Bar Yumi, Amar of Nachman. If Yosef Bar Yumi says in the name of Rav Nachman, Shkiv Mirah Shekosef Kol Nechosav La'atei, a Shkiv Mirah, someone who's on his deathbed. He said he gifts all of his assets to his slave. But Amban, and he gets up, he can withdraw his commitment to giving the assets, but he cannot withdraw his commitment that the slave remains freed. So the Gemara says, he can withdraw the assets, and he doesn't have to give him everything, because because the gift that a person gives on his deathbed is presuming that he dies. If he doesn't die, the gift is invalid. However, with regard to the slave himself, but he cannot, the slave remains freed. Why? Because he freed him already. He's been called a free man. Amar Rashi gave the following resolution. Hasam had a time mission to love cross gitahu. 1 second. Okay, hold on. Okay, so Mars is as follows. The truth of the matter is that Rav Nachman does not, the reasoning of Rav Meir is not because of Pagina Dibura. Rav Nachman is perfectly fine to say Pagina Dibura, just like he is by the story of Shkev Mira. Shkev Mira, what happens? The guy says, everything belongs to you, my slave. And what do we say? You actually acquired, you acquired yourself, but you didn't acquire anything else. It's classical Pagina Dibura. And that works with Rav Meir and works with Rav Nachman. So then, if that's the case, that we do say Pagin Dibura, why does Rav Meir say, with regard to the fact that the guy says, I'm giving you everything except for my house? And we say, well, you don't get anything. You don't even get yourself. What's the explanation there? The explanation has nothing to do with Pagin Dibura. The explanation has to do with the concept of called Krus Gita. 1 second. Yeah. But it is very simple, because the statement of divorce, in other words, the statement that he's freeing his slave, is not clearly specified in the document. And we have reason to suspect that he was not serious about it because he left out a few other things in the document. He didn't give him everything. He gave him everything except for a few things. So therefore, the document fails to completely cut him off from his master. Sorry. The document fails to completely cut him off from his master. And because of that, that is why the slave is not completely freed. So this is an idea that has, so basically the verse that tells us that a slave can be freed is or a document of freedom has to be given to the slave. But law means to her, and law is the same word that's used with regard to Gittin. Because of law, safer priestess. So we say that the rules of get of a divorce are similar to the laws of freeing a slave. And just like with regard to a woman who's being freed, a woman who's being divorced, the document has to clearly specify that she is completely freed and she's permitted to do whatever she wants. So too, the document that frees a slave must also be very clear and specific. In this instance, the document is not specific because he never specified that the slave is freed. And therefore, because there's another way out, in other words, because the guy left over his house, he said, I'm giving you everything except for my house. So we presume that the slave actually is also included in that. The slave is also left over. Not because of Pagina Dibura, but because the document didn't specify the slave itself is freed. Basically, there's two ways to free a slave. Give everything to the slave, or give him a document that says you are freed. Or states that you are freed and you get ... If you give a document that's not specific and it has an exception, well, maybe the slave is included in that exception as well. Okay. That's the next Gemara. We'll come back to get Shechur very shortly. If somebody makes a claim against the divorce, again, this is a divorce that came to court, the messenger says, if there's error and there's people complaining, we'll verify the document. 1 second. Sorry, this is a divorce that's brought inside of Israel, right? Yeah. A divorce is brought inside of Israel. If the document is not, nobody said b'fanei nechtam. So the document remains unverified, and if there's a complaint, we'll verify the document using kiyum shtaros, the verification of signatures. So the Gemara says, Erakama, how many people does it take to make a complaint? So the Gemara says, Ilaim erachad, if it means even one person, va'amar v'yechon says, Divra kol ein erapachas mishnayim. You need two people to complain. The Ella, you're right. Trey. It's not about two people complaining. So the Gemara says, if it's two people complaining, then you have two witnesses. Trey training him. So you have a contradiction of the witnesses. And why is the divorce valid if you have contradicting witnesses? In other words, even if you verify the document, it's 2 against 2. So how is it verified? Simura says, it's the complaint of the husband. The husband says the document is a forged document. And because the husband is the Baal Din, he's the one that would have authored the document, he's believed that with regard to the fact that we will verify further and see if indeed the document is valid or not. Okay. Hamevi get Medina Siyam, somebody who brings a divorce from outside of Israel. But he is not able to make the statement of a fanenechtam. Why not? So we'll cheat a little bit here, and we'll remember the Gemara from a few days ago, where we saw that the guy was a healthy person who became a deaf mute. So because he's a mute, he can't make the statement of a fanenechtam. And presumably he's deranged as well, so which means he can't even write it. If he would write it, presumably that would be valid as well. Okay. If there are witnesses, it's guy he verified signatures and the document is valid. Okay. This is true both with regard to divorces of a woman and the document that frees a slave. They have a better word for shikhr. What do they call a shikhr document in the art scroll?
Oh.
How does the art scroll translate shikhr?
Emancipation document.
Emancipation document. Okay, better word. Okay. So the document, a divorce and an emancipation is considered the same. They have the same status. And like we explained, the two documents are compared to one another and they have similar laws. The laws of bringing a document of emancipation have the same rules of a fanenechtam, and this is one of the ways in which divorces and emancipations are similar. And the Gemara will explain another two different ways, and we'll discuss that further and probably take us for the day. Okay, let's begin the Gemara. What does it mean that the person can't say a fanenechtam? What happened? Why not? So the Gemara says, if he was a deaf mute and deranged. The Gemara says, could a deranged person bring a divorce? But tonight we learned that everyone is able to bring a get, with the exception of those who are, psychosis. They're disconnected from reality, or they're immature. We're talking about an instance where they gave a document to one second. Hold on a second. They gave the document to the messenger when he was a pikach, when he was sane. But then during the journey, he didn't have a chance to make the statement of a fanenechtam until he went mad, and he was no longer present, and therefore he cannot make the statement of fanenechtam. It is similar with regard to a divorce or with regard to an emancipation. The rabbis taught there are three ways in which a divorce is similar to an emancipation. It's similar in the manner that both the one who brings it and whether it's from outside of Israel to Israel or from Israel to outside of Israel, they need to make the statement of fanenechtam, which is what we learned in the Mishnah. The kolgat sheyeshav of eid kusi posel. If the witnesses are not kosher witnesses, the document is invalid. I'm sorry. So these kusim are these sort of fake conversions. So in general, we don't rely on their testimony. With regard to divorces and emancipations, we would rely on such testimony. Okay. And moreover, you have a document that was written in a non-Jewish court. It's a kosher document. You can use it in a Jewish court to presume that a certain agreement took place. Except with the exception of divorces and emancipations. And it's because these documents of divorce and emancipation, have a spiritual significance to them, right? In other words, a married woman is she has the spiritual status of being a married woman, and the only way to get rid of that status is by giving a document that was written according to halacha, according to Jewish law. A non-Jewish court cannot write a Jewish divorce, and similarly is true with an emancipation. if the slave is a Jew, is an Eved Kanani, so he's an indentured so-called Jewish slave. The reason why he's a so-called Jewish slave is because he doesn't have the commandments that a regular Jew has. He has same commandments, basically the same level as a woman. And if that's the case, then you want to give him the spiritual significance, for example, that he's obligated to put on tefillin, because a slave is otherwise not obligated to put on tefillin. If that's the case, then you have to, it has to be written by a Jewish court. Okay, and with regard to, according to the opinion of Rameir, there are 4 ways in which they're similar. What's the opinion of Rameir? Rameir says that if a guy makes a messenger to provide a document to his, either a divorce to his wife or a shikhr or an emancipation to a slave, and the document hasn't yet reached the slave, he can call up the shliach, the messenger, and say, don't give it. Okay, according to the rabbis, that is true with regard to a divorce, but it's not true with regard to a slave. And why is that? Because the presumption of the Gemara is that a slave wants to become free. This, by the way, is far from an obvious presumption, because according to Jewish law, a non-Jewish slave has, in terms of his moral fidelity in marriage, has very little requirement to do so. He's allowed to sleep with any non-Jewish slave, whatever, any shifta kananis. Technically speaking, doesn't really even get married. There is sort of a relationship the Torah says called a shifta charufa. Shifta charufa is we're a slave. This is the presumption is that this is how it typically would happen, where you had a slave that was, served his master appropriately. His master would dedicate a maidservant to be his dedicated woman. She's not a wife. There's no marriage here. There's no way for a slave cannot get married. There's no framework of marriage. If he decides to have a long-term love affair with one of the maidservants, that's fine. If his master decides to dedicate him a shifcha charufa, a dedicated maidservant, that's acceptable as well. But generally speaking, there's no moral strictures. So the Gemara has a fundamental question. It's not in Subis. It's on where is it? It's on see it Gimel maybe. It's by the Sugya of Gerkotan. The Gemara has a fundamental question whether a slave really wants to be free. Maybe he'd rather live a life of moral promiscuity than be a free man and have to live like everybody else. So now this is a debate with regard to a slave. The rabbis say that an indentured servant does want to become free, and therefore, as soon as the messenger acquires as soon as the messenger is given the document, he effectively acquires it on behalf of the slave. The slave is immediately a free man. Just like, for example, if I gave Jules a gift, $100 to give to Eric. So as soon as I give you the money to give to Eric, I can no longer take it back, because you've acquired it on Eric's behalf. Presumably Eric wants $100, maybe not from me. But presumably he wants the money, and therefore you can acquire it on his behalf. You do acquire it immediately for his behalf.
You just try taking it back.
Whereas according to Rameir says with regard to a slave, that's not the case. So a slave does not, according to Rameir, the messenger does not acquire it on behalf of the slave, and therefore the messenger, if the owner can effectively call up the messenger at any given point before the document is delivered and say, stop, don't want the document to be delivered. That would be the fourth difference between Rameir and the rabbis. Okay. The Gemara says, Bishlem Rabbanon, according to the rabbi's opinion, it makes sense. Minyana, the count, why the number 3 is used. The Mutu had Rameir. It's 3, not 4. In other words, not the opinion of Rameir. Because in Rameir's opinion, there's a difference between a divorce and an emancipation. El Rameir, Minyana, the Mutu Mai. According to Rameir, number 4 is coming to exclude what? So the Gemara says, this is the exclusion. The Tanya we learn, if the witnesses do not know how to sign their names, I don't know what this is called in English. Basically, what you do is you use cloth. Cloth is it's a very thick substance. By the way, cloth of times of yore, before the relative modern days of 60, 70 years ago, cloth was much thicker. If you've got Kesser's Torah, the ancient one, cloth is way thicker. And what you can do is you can actually etch into the cloth. You can do this on a regular cloth also, but it's very easy to rip. If you etch an ancient cloth and the cloth of yore, it's much harder to rip. As a matter of fact, in the old version of cloth, you're actually able to peel off a layer. If you make a mistake, say if you're making a mistake, instead of having to cut out the whole cloth, you could literally peel off a layer and right underneath it.
What happened? What changed?
We figured out how to make our cloth much thinner. Most of it has to do with the advances in planing. So we plane our cloth much to a much thinner level. Okay. Anyway, you take cloth, the old form of cloth. What you can do is you can etch out a signature, and the guy just pours the ink into the signature, right? And then it just fills in the spaces. So that's a signature. When is this true? This is only true with regard to divorces, but other documents, if you can't find somebody to sign, then go find somebody else. In other words, divorce is sort of sometimes an urgency to have divorce written, and therefore will tolerate somebody who doesn't know how to sign, and will allow him to sign by pouring ink into a signature etch of his name. However, with regard to other documents, there's no urgency. Go find somebody else. And that's the difference between divorces and shechur. Imlav ein chaismin. So Gemara says, kriya mandachar shmei. It says they have to know how to read and sign. Well, 1 second. We weren't talking about reading. We were just talking about signing. So Gemara says, you're right. We're missing the Bryce is missing. Where's Vachtani? Edim she'en yodin likrois karan lefneim. Witnesses who don't know how to read, you read the document for them. In other words, you have a guy who you want to sign a divorce. He can't read the divorce, so read it for him. The chaitzman, or if they don't know how to sign, you etch out into the parchment a signature, and they pour the ink in. However, if a document of emancipation or any other document for that matter, they need to know how to read the document and how to sign it. They can't do both steps. The click box, I've read and understood, nobody reads and nobody understands it. So you can't read, you can't understand, and don't buy it. Don't sign the document. By divorce, it's necessary to accommodate people who can't read and can't sign. But otherwise, there's no need to accommodate them, and therefore go find somebody else. And this is not a difference between divorces and this is a difference between divorces and emancipations. In other words, divorce is treated differently than an emancipation, and that's why Rameir gave the number 4. Okay, we'll stop here, and God willing, we'll catch up with Yom Tov.